This is my audience for today. This will be my speech on minimum wage issues. What was the lowest paying job you've ever had? For some, it could have been $7.25 living in Texas. For me, it was $14 an hour living in California. Now think of that gap. Two people earning the minimum wage at two different standards. Every state is different when looking at their minimum wages, but the biggest issue is the federal minimum wage. Currently, it stands at $7.25 and has not changed since 2009, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. Considering this, take a look at the job you may be working right now. What is the current pay, and what are the wages that are closer to your pay? If not, or if so, what are those two who are above and below your pay wage? The gap between those two may be a little or a lot, but the important part is that it often varies, and most times, jobs will not pay the bare minimum because it is not livable. The biggest reason I chose this topic is because of my move from California to Texas. My first job here was paying me $8.25 an hour, and I got pretty short hours. After a few weeks, I found myself out of a job and almost out of my last paycheck. The difference between here and California is very large in that sense, but it showed me how different the minimum wages would be. If I was working as much as I could, I wouldn't be able to afford rent, let alone food. I want to do my best to understand every situation that people endure, as well as the livability of each check that people bring in. In this speech, I will be discussing the issues of the minimum wage the federal government has set, as well as the livability of these wages depending on the state you reside in. In this slide, you can see the different wages of Texas and California. Texas follows the federal minimum wage, while California is at $16 an hour because of the mass amount of change that they have economically. Our current issue resides in the federal government's minimum wage, as it gives states and businesses the ability to give the least amount to those who work hard for the money. While it really depends on the state you reside, most places are rising in prices, whether it's through gas, rent, or food prices. Living in California all my life, I never understood the rising cost of living as much as I do in Texas because it was constantly high either way. In California, you could be making six figures and still struggle to no end. In Texas, it is easier to live with a lower wage. It may not be comfortable or easy, but it works. The biggest difference between these two is the ability to self-sustain. Texas is one of the most self-sustaining states because of the vast amount of agriculture and petroleum produced. Though California is similar in that feat, its population is too high, as is its cost of living. In researching the United States Census Bureau, I found that there were 10 million more people in California than in Texas, despite the larger size of Texas. This may not account for every person in the state, but it gives a good idea of how many people are living in these states despite the high cost of living. Moving back to the minimum wage, as prices rise, livability declines. The amount of homeless and people using food stamps because of the lack of jobs or wages has increased over time due to COVID struggles and many other different internal issues. The struggle has to do with being unable to find a job or having a job that underpays the worker, which can be a whole other issue in itself. With that said, people are being vastly underpaid in the states that follow the federal minimum wage, and that needs to change. Our struggle, making that change, is difficult. Realistically, we can't change the minimum wage to $20 an hour. I believe moving the minimum wage to $13 to $15 an hour would fit the country best, as it would help improve the ability to live comfortably and give a chance to those who are unable to earn as they need. In an article about raising the minimum wage by the American Federation of Labor and Congress of the Industrial Organizations, they state that 2/3 of Americans supported a raise in minimum wage to $15 an hour, but has not changed since. This is good to note, as it shows that people are interested in the change. It simply has not reached a point where that can happen. How can we make the change specifically? The best place to look towards is the government and who is currently leading. As seen in questions and answers for the U.S. Department of Labor, a wage change must first go through Congress and be signed by law by the President. It's a big feat, but if it's but it can be possible if people put their foot forward and do their best to make that change. Now imagine, several years from now, you could be living in a new house with a new family, paying a mortgage. You could be traveling the country, exploring something new. Why is that? Because an increase in our wages. If we can increase the minimum wage, we can begin living a more comfortable life and find more enjoyment in what we have over what we need. This could be a big moment for people who survive paycheck to paycheck, a moment for those who use food stamps to finally be able to afford to feed themselves and their families, a moment for the homeless to get back on their feet and possibly start better programs for those still struggling. There's a lot of change that comes with moving the wage up, and while it may be difficult, it is something we should strive for. Today we have discussed the large differences between Texas, California, and the federal government's minimum wages, as well as the livability of them. Here, I would like you to look at your current wage and ask yourself if it's a wage you're comfortable with. If it's not, what can you do to change it? If you can vote, take the time to do so when change is possible. As author Lawrence Glickman said in his book, A Living Wage, American Workers, and the Making of Consumer Society about Livable Wages, it is a wage level that offers workers the ability to support families, to maintain self-respect, and to have both the means and the leisure to participate in the civic life of the nation. Take the time to understand your needs and what you have to do to work for that. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.